This is one of those subjects I have touched on before, but I think it's relevant with a lot of the discourse that's going on these days in the UK. The subject is free speech, and from the outset of this video, I want to make it very, very clear that I think free speech is very important. I think it's one of the absolute hallmarks of a free society. But when I say free speech, I'm talking about free speech that doesn't cross a line. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that I am not a free speech absolutist. And this is something that I think not enough people really consider. You know, we hear about free speech all the time. We hear about it kind of weaponized by both left and right. And both left and right have at times been accused of violating free speech. I mean, at the moment, conservatives and the right are very much claiming to be crusaders of free speech, and the implication being that it's the left who are trying to trample it. Well, I do have significant concerns about things like non-crime hate incidents being used by the police, by overzealous police, to basically harass the public for having disagreements or for misunderstandings, that sort of thing. And I know there's significant concern about things like the Online Safety Act. Toxic, one of my subscribers, I know you've raised this issue a few times. I'm not going to go into huge detail about it here, but I totally understand your concerns. I do think the Online Safety Act has been misused. And I do think that freedom of expression is under threat in this country, actually. I don't think we can be complacent about it. However, I do think it is important to point out that free speech absolutism is not something that is always a good thing. And I think that a lot of people would be reactionary to this. They say you either believe in free speech or you don't. But that absolutist point is important. If you really insist that you believe in free speech as an absolutist point, that is to say, people could say absolutely anything they want, really think about that, then really, technically, that includes the right to speak out threats, right? To make false allegations, to incite violence. Now, the free speech absolutists will say, no, we're not saying that. But I would point out to them, well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you're an absolutist, like you absolutely believe that there should be no boundaries whatsoever, and yet you're claiming that you don't support those things. The point I'm making is, if you're an absolutist, then by definition you would have to support those things. Because making a threat, whilst in most jurisdictions is a criminal offence, and I think it should be, is still a speech, it's still words, right? Making a false allegation is words. You know, if a woman goes to the police and says she's been raped and she hasn't been, those are fundamentally words that she is uttering. This guy raped me, you know, and it may be a totally innocent man. Maybe she's getting revenge on him, or who knows. But this is why I wish people would think a little bit more about the absolutist part of it. Now, I do think that with free speech there has to be as wide a spectrum as possible. What I mean by that is everyone should be allowed a viewpoint, whether their views are right-wing, left-wing, centrist. I even believe people should have a right to be obnoxious, right? Even insulting. I don't think, unless it is really, really like harassment, unless it's getting in someone's face, unless it's targeted bullying, I don't think that insulting someone should be a police matter. Now, if you get some yobs harassing someone, that's different. That's, you know, intimidating. That's unpleasant. But simply, like, for example, I get called names all the time on this channel. I'm not going to run to the police about that. It's annoying, and I don't think it carries much weight, but I'm not going to run to the police about it. And, you know, I've proven that I believe in free speech by allowing critical comments all the time. So I think that the spectrum of free speech should be as wide as possible. And I would never want to see a situation where, indeed, like I say, we can't be complacent in this country, where legislation is used to silence free speech. And I do think there are some pressure groups, lobby groups, For example, I would mention the campaign against anti-Semitism. They've attacked Miriam Margolyes recently because she's criticised Israel. Now, the precise words that she's used wouldn't necessarily be what I would use, but that's beside the point. I think they've clearly tried to weaponise anti-Semitism to silence anyone who criticises Israeli policy. I think Islamophobia has been used as a weapon by Islamists on many occasions, and I think we need to very closely scrutinise how the government's processing the definition of Islamophobia. There's talk that it may be scrapped altogether, and I hope it is, because there's a big difference between criticising Islam and saying, I think this faith has a problem with violence, and I think it does. I think there is definitely a problem with extremism in Islam, versus just hating all Muslims and vilifying all Muslims. So free speech has to include the right to, forcefully debate. It has to include the right to even be insulting, although that's not the most adult or practical way to go forward. But frankly, sometimes it does have some merit. I mean, I'm not going to be overly sensitive when I talk about people who support Putin. I'm not going to be overly diplomatic or full of etiquette, because I don't think they deserve respect. I really, really don't. I don't think that's a worldview that deserves any respect. So I believe in being even forceful in opinions, but I just don't agree in absolutism. And there's a group called I think it's the Free Speech Union, run by Toby Young. Now, I do not agree with his position, or what his position seems to be, that even inciting violence should be seen as a trivial thing. With the Lucy Connolly thing, he said she was guilty of a brain fart, in other words, just being reckless. But by saying that, he's trivialising it. And this is what the right have been doing, and it's what frustrates me about the case. The right are distorting this. They're implying that this is a woman who's simply been jailed because she happens to be a conservative. No, she's been held to account because she incited violence. She did not take her post down immediately. Let's stop with that myth. She kept it up for over 3 hours. It was seen by 310,000 people. And it wasn't just a few hot words. This was really vitriolic, a vitriolic call for violence. She was saying, for all I care, they can burn people alive. That is a horrible, disgusting thing to say. And for anyone who thinks that mere words are harmless, I'm not talking about sticks and stones. I'm not talking about sensitivity here. There is empirical evidence throughout history that demagogues, populists, some populists and extremist groups have used words to incite violence directly. One of the most glaring examples I would use is the Rwandan Genocide. During those events, 100 days of bloodshed in that small East African country, the Hutu power radio stations, this was the radio stations controlled by the Interahamwe militia and other militia groups on the Hutu side, they were using euphemisms like cut the tall trees, because the Tutsis were said to be physically taller. And they were using dehumanizing language, like calling them cockroaches and insects and stuff like that. So my point to someone like Toby Young would be, if you really think that words are harmless, look at something like that. Now, obviously, I'm not saying the Lucy Connolly case is comparable to a genocide that killed up to 1 million people, but it does underline the point that incitement is not harmless. If you look at the United States at the first half of the 20th century, when you had lynchings, they were whipped up by demagogues. When you had black men lynched in the street for looking at a white woman the wrong way. And I'm uneasy about these hotel protests. I do think there's a mob-like mentality about it. So I really have a problem with people who seem to think that free speech means you could say whatever you want. And frankly, at the moment, conservatives are more guilty of that than the left, although the left at times have also been guilty of it. I mean, I think of the likes of Kneecap, the things that they've said at their concerts, and then the left come and defend them and say, oh, but they're telling the truth about the Palestinians. I don't care what your ideology is. If you incite violence, you're inciting violence. If there's any exception to this, it would be in an absolute clear-cut self-defense situation. So I wouldn't lecture Ukrainians, for example, for saying we need weapons to kill Russian invaders, because that is literally about the survival of the country. That is literally a matter of self-defense. So I think I do take an exception, or I do see an exception in that rule to clear-cut self-defense. But I suppose I'd have to draw a red line. Like, for example, if a Ukrainian was saying, kill every Russian living in the West, that would be going too far, because that would be including Russians who may well be anti-Putin. It would be, targeting people in terms of violence solely for their nationality, not for a position that they hold in terms of supporting that invasion. I'll wrap this up, but anyone who thinks that free speech absolutism is harmless or a form of liberty is being incredibly naive, because by being a free speech absolutist, you may well be taking away the liberty of others by taking away their safety, by inciting violence. So I was going to sort of align myself with the Free Speech Union, but I don't agree with the absolutist ideology of Toby Young. His attitude to the Connolly case I have a problem with. And the right in general. I had one person on my last video, on the Lucy Connolly video, complain about the mainstream media. He's ignoring the fact that the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the Sun, if they're not mainstream, what are they? They sell millions of papers a day. They are mainstream tabloids. So how can you claim it's not the mainstream narrative to defend her? I would argue a sizable portion of the British media right now veers to the right. Overall, it's probably 50-50, but certainly with the print press, it's well on the right. If you break it down, what do we have? We have the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the London Evening Standard, the Sun, the Star. They're all on the right. On the left, you have the Guardian, the Independent, the Eye. Not much else. Morning Star, but it's very small. So when it comes to the print press, it's overwhelmingly on the right. That's a fact. Broadcast media is a bit more nuanced. The BBC, most would say, is more on the left. Channel 4 News is on the left. Sky, I would say, sort of in the middle. ITV, kind of in the middle. But yeah, this idea that the mainstream media isn't right-wing is ridiculous. I guarantee you right now there's a lot of right-wing hacks out there trying to turn Lucy Connolly into the poster girl of freedom. She's not. She's someone who's simply been held to account for inciting violence. That's it. It's not like she's just been plucked out of the crowd and said, oh, this is a random conservative we're going to punish for being a conservative. Another point about this case, I've often been very critical of the judiciary, and I still am in many ways, but when people say that Lucy Connolly was a victim of politics, it wasn't Keir Starmer or Yvette Cooper that sentenced her. It was the judge involved in her case. I don't know who the presiding judge was, but that's, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary wouldn't have been able to interfere in that, because that's the whole point of judicial independence. So again, the right are spinning a false narrative on this. Anyway, free speech absolutism, anyone who believes that, I would say, it's the old adage, don't yell fire in a crowded theatre. I believe in free speech. I believe it should be for everyone. I believe it should be as broad as possible. But I do think there should be some limits. I don't think people have a right to make false allegations. I don't think people have a right to incite violence. And where there is also national security issues involved, and I mean clear-cut national security issues. For instance, I don't think that Russian state media should be allowed to broadcast in this country, which is why I welcomed Ofcom finally taking away the license from RT. Why? Because it's a mouthpiece of the Putin regime. There's no logic, there's no sense in allowing our enemies to use our values against us. That's crazy. So, yeah, I do draw a line with that.